I never thought I'd stand on this porch again, staring at the same faded wreath that hung here 5 years ago, its berries cracked and peeling under the cold. Snow drifted around my boots, in soft spirals, settling on the welcome mat that had never welcomed me. Inside laughter floated through the windows, thin, rehearsed, and painfully familiar. For 5 Christmases, I sat alone in my apartment watching the world celebrate while my phone stayed dark, not a single Merry Christmas from the people who raised me. To them, I had stopped existing the moment I left this house. And yet the second Forbes published that article, the young woman behind a $50 million empire, my mother's honeyed voice appeared on my voicemail, calling me their family's pride, pretending the 5 years of silence had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Now here I was, standing in the glow of their porch light, the cold biting my fingers as I gripped the door handle. Inside, I could hear clinking glasses and chairs sliding across hardwood as if they were setting the stage for a performance. They had no idea what I carried with me: 5 years of estranged family memories. 5 years of family drama. 5 years of being an abandoned daughter, learning how to build a life without them. I wasn't here for forgiveness. I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here for truth. And with one sentence, one that had been echoing in my mind since the day they cut me off, this entire house would fall silent. But before I could face them, I had to face the girl I used to be. I remember the first time I realized Christmas in our house wasn't about joy. I was 8, maybe 9, standing in the living room of our old Maplewood home while my mother adjusted the lights on the tree. She always dressed it like she dressed everything else in our lives, perfectly, meticulously, obsessively. If one ornament hung slightly crooked, she yanked it off and replaced the whole branch. She called it creating a picture-perfect holiday. I later learned it was the beginning of the family performance she curated every year, meant to convince neighbors that our family was flawless. I wasn't part of that performance, not really. Not once did she ask me where I wanted the angel topper or how I wanted the candy canes arranged. Instead, she used those moments to show me and everyone else how imperfect I was. "Stand straighter," she would hiss, as her friends gathered around the fireplace. "Stop fidgeting, smile properly." If I said the wrong thing or spoke too softly or touched the wrong decoration, she corrected me immediately, loud enough for every adult in the room to hear. It wasn't anger. It was humiliation masked as guidance, a polished form of public shaming that felt like a cold hand around my throat. My brother Mason never faced that. He could run through the house, break ornaments, spill cocoa all over the carpet, and still end up with a kiss on the forehead. And a boys will be boys from our mother. He was the pride of the family, the golden child, the one she held up as proof that she had done something right. With him, she was warm. With me, she was ice. Looking back, I think she saw me as the crack in her perfect image. The daughter who didn't fit the narrative she wanted to show the world. A problem to be managed. There was a Christmas when I was 10 that plays in my mind like a movie scene I can never turn off. There had been a small gift under the tree with my name on it, a rectangular package wrapped in gold paper. I remember touching it every day leading up to Christmas Eve, imagining what it might be. But when we gathered around the tree that night, the gift was gone. My mother shrugged when I asked. My father looked away. Mason smirked into his hot chocolate. I tried not to cry, telling myself maybe I had imagined it, maybe I was wrong. That was the beginning of me doubting my own memory, doubting my own voice. Years of gaslighting don't start with yelling. They start with moments like that, tiny fractures that turn into fault lines. As I grew older, the gaslighting became more precise. "You're too sensitive," she'd say whenever I flinched at her criticism. "You're remembering it wrong," if I ever tried to defend myself. She even convinced my father that my reactions were exaggerated, that I made up stories to get attention. And because he was too quiet, too afraid to challenge her, he believed her. Or he pretended to. The attic was my first clue that something was truly wrong in our family. I was 12 when I found the cedar chest dark wood brass lock tucked behind boxes of Christmas ornaments. I remember lifting the lid just a crack and seeing hospital envelopes, the edges yellowed with age. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they were important. I barely had time to read the top of the first paper before my mother appeared in the doorway. She snapped the lid shut, grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks, and ordered me downstairs. "Curiosity ruins girls," she whispered. I didn't understand it then, but now, standing on her porch 5 years after she erased me from her life, I know that chest held the truth she spent decades burying. When I was 16, after another humiliating Christmas dinner filled with comparisons to Mason and snide remarks disguised as jokes, my father came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed and whispered, "One day the truth will find you." Then he left without another word. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged that something in our house was deeply wrong, and the last time he tried to protect me. By the time I was 21, the fractures in our family had deepened beyond repair. I had moved out, found a studio apartment in Columbus, and was working nights at a diner to pay for community college classes. That Christmas was the first one where I waited for a call that never came. I sat on the cold floor of my apartment, holding my phone, willing it to ring. Midnight passed. Christmas morning came, but nothing. No message, no apology. No love. That was the year I realized silence could be a weapon. Their silence cut deeper than any insult they'd ever thrown at me. And that was the Christmas I knew they had abandoned me fully and completely. I built myself from that silence. Every night shift, every class, every journal entry, every small digital workbook I created for people healing from trauma. Every dollar I saved. Every tear I hid. All of it built the foundation of what would one day be a $50 million company. Not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted a life where my worth wasn't determined by someone else's broken expectations. I'm not the girl who begged for her mother's approval anymore. I'm not the daughter who stayed quiet to avoid becoming the center of family drama. I'm not the abandoned child sitting in an empty apartment hoping for a call that would never come. I'm the woman who returned on her own terms, the woman they ignored until it benefited them not to. The woman standing on this porch with the truth in her hands. I exhaled into the cold air, my breath forming a thin cloud in front of me. The laughter inside grew louder, but it didn't shake me anymore. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and gripped the doorknob. It was time. Time for them to see the daughter they discarded. Time for them to hear the truth they buried. Time for them to understand that I didn't come home to belong. I came home to speak. The house always looked softer in my memories than it truly was. Back then, I convinced myself that the smell of cinnamon candles and lemon furniture polish meant warmth, that the carefully arranged wreaths and matching stockings meant love. I didn't have the language to understand that a house could look perfect while feeling hollow. I only knew that the closer Christmas came each year, the more tightly my mother wound herself, and the more carefully I learned to move through the rooms, trying not to trigger whatever version of her I'd be facing that day. When I was 8, Christmas Eve felt like a stage production. My mother's voice would echo down the hallway as she arranged garlands on the staircase, ordering me to stand straighter, smile wider, try harder. "People are watching," she'd warn as she tugged a brush through my hair. "We can't have you looking sloppy." She said it with the same tone people use to warn a child about touching a hot stove, like she was protecting me, when really she was protecting only herself. The neighbors would arrive with homemade cookies and loud laughter, calling our house so festive, never noticing how my mother's eyes darted everywhere, tracking my posture, my expressions, even how I held my glass of lemonade. The public humiliation always came dressed as motherly concern. If I stumbled over a word, she would chuckle, "Oh, Elena gets so nervous around people." If I accidentally used the wrong fork during dinner, she'd correct me in front of everyone, with a gentle hand on my shoulder and a sharp whisper in my ear. I learned early that being less noticeable meant being less of a problem. Mason, meanwhile, could spill gravy on the tablecloth, run through the living room with muddy shoes, or break a snow globe, and she'd laugh like it was charming. She told him he was spirited. She told me I was difficult. With every Christmas, the line between motherly affection and emotional discipline blurred further. I tried to ignore the tightening in my chest, the dread that built each year as the decorations came down from the attic. I tried to believe the story she told me, that I was too sensitive, that I misremembered things, that Mason didn't get more love, he just needed more attention. Gaslighting doesn't feel like abuse when you're a child. It feels like confusion. It feels like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. The attic was where the puzzle first became terrifying. I was 12 when I found that cedar chest. My mother had asked me to fetch the Christmas linens from upstairs. The attic was cold, always cold, the kind of cold that makes you feel watched even when you're alone. The bulb flickered overhead as I pushed boxes aside, trying to find the red and green storage bin she wanted. That's when I saw the chest, dark wood, brass hinges, the carved lid gleaming faintly under the dim light. It wasn't locked that day. I only meant to peek inside to satisfy a small, innocent curiosity. But the moment I lifted the lid, the air around me shifted like the house itself held its breath. Inside were hospital envelopes, legal papers, and what looked like a birth certificate. My birth certificate. Except something was off: the handwriting, the signatures, the dates. I didn't understand what any of it meant, but I knew it shouldn't be hidden up there like contraband. I didn't get a chance to examine it. My mother appeared in the doorway with a face carved out of stone, eyes sharp and cold. She didn't shout. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she walked calmly across the room, closed the chest with a quiet but deliberate snap, and wrapped her fingers around my wrist. "Curiosity ruins girls," she whispered, breath hot against my cheek. "Stay out of things that don't belong to you." I wanted to ask why my own birth certificate didn't belong to me, but the words died in my throat when she tightened her grip. After that, I never went into the attic alone again. Between 12 and 17, my mother perfected her emotional craft. She rewrote memories so convincingly that I began to doubt my own mind. If I reminded her of something she'd said, she'd respond, "You always twist things." If I reacted to her criticism, she'd sigh, "Why do you make everything so dramatic?" If I cried, she'd accuse me of manipulation, even though she was the one pulling every string. My father, caught in the crossfire, learned to disappear. He buried himself in work, in football games, in anything that allowed him to avoid choosing sides. When she snapped at me during dinner, he kept his eyes fixed on his plate. When I asked for help with homework and she claimed I was lying for attention, he said nothing. Silence became his shield in my prison. I realized years later that he loved peace more than he loved truth. One Christmas, when I was 16, after a particularly brutal dinner where my mother made a joke about me never being quite right, I found my father standing in my doorway. He looked like a shadow of himself. Pale shoulders, hunched guilt hanging around him like smoke. He sat beside me and whispered, "Don't take what your mother says too seriously. One day the truth will find you." I wanted to ask what truth. I wanted him to stay. Instead, he patted my knee, stood up, and walked out before I could speak. His warning felt like a door that opened and closed too quickly to glimpse what was inside. By the time I turned 17, I had learned to stay quiet at Christmas. The more silent I was, the less she had to correct. The less visible I became, the less pain there was. I faded myself out of family photos by stepping just a little too far to the side, volunteering to take the picture, pretending I didn't care. I watched the dynamic unfold like a ritual, Mason radiant, and adored my mother glowing with pride, my father sitting with a tired smile that never reached his eyes, and me somewhere in the background, always out of focus. Years later, when I looked back at those photos, I saw it clearly. I wasn't part of the family narrative. I was the cautionary tale, the shadow, the part of the story my mother tried to edit out. My last Christmas at home was the quietest of them all. I remember standing in the kitchen washing dishes while they laughed in the living room. They didn't notice when I slipped on my coat or when I walked out into the snow. They didn't notice when I left the house entirely. It would be 5 years before they heard my voice again. Now, as I stood on their porch as an adult, a successful woman, a CEO, someone who had built a $50 million empire without a single word of encouragement from them, I felt the weight of all those lost Christmases pressing against my ribs. But the pain was different now. Not sharp like it used to be, not suffocating. It was a memory, nothing more. The version of me who once begged for their approval was gone. The girl they ignored was gone. The young woman whose voice they tried to bury had learned how to speak loudly enough for the world to hear. Inside the house, someone laughed, a shrill, familiar sound that used to split me open. Now it barely grazed my skin. I lifted my hand to knock, not as the child they trained to shrink, but as the woman who returned by choice. This time I wasn't walking into a home. I was walking into the truth. The year I turned 21 winter felt sharper than usual, like the cold itself was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I was living in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where the heat rattled through metal vents and the walls smelled faintly of detergent. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was the first space I had ever lived in where nobody corrected the way I sat, the way I spoke, or the way I smiled. Silence there wasn't a punishment. It was freedom. I was juggling 2 part-time jobs, one at a diner, one shelving books at the campus library, and taking classes whenever I could afford them. Psychology, business writing. Anything that made me feel like I was building something, even if I didn't know what that something would become. Nights were long and money was tight, but I was breathing in a way I never had at home. My father called once a week at first. Always from the garage or the car, always speaking in a hushed voice like he was afraid someone might overhear him offering me affection. "Are you eating enough?" he'd whisper. "Do you need anything?" I'd tell him I was fine even when I wasn't. I didn't want him to worry. Or maybe I didn't want to give my mother another reason to say I was a burden. But as the weeks passed, his calls grew shorter, then less frequent, then distant. Sometimes he'd start to say something. "There's something you should know," but he'd cut himself off the moment. I asked what he meant. I didn't understand it then, but now I know fear was always living inside him. Fear of my mother, fear of truth, fear of what would happen if he chose me. Late in November, just as the stores began hanging Christmas lights and the air filled with the scent of pine-scented candles, I received a certified envelope addressed to me. The return address was from a law office in Maplewood. I didn't know any lawyers. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was a mistake. Inside was a letter from my grandmother's attorney. She had passed away earlier that year. The letter stated there was a small trust set aside for me, nothing extravagant but meaningful. Enough to help pay for college or start a small business. The trust, however, was frozen pending parental review. Parental review. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at those words, my heart beat loud in my ears. Why would my parents have anything to do with a trust meant for me? I didn't need anyone to explain what frozen really meant. It meant blocked, controlled, hidden. I called the attorney listed at the bottom of the letter. He sounded surprised, too surprised, when he realized I had received the notice. "I assumed your parents informed you years ago," he said, slowly choosing each word with caution. When I told him they hadn't, he hesitated long enough for my stomach to twist. Finally, he said, "I'm not at liberty to discuss everything, but..." The documents we received were difficult to verify. 2 signatures did not match earlier records. Forged signatures. The phrase stuck in my throat like glass. I thanked him and hung up, then called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. The moment she answered, the temperature in the room dropped. "What?" she said sharply, as if my name on her caller ID had personally offended her. I asked her about the trust. I asked her why I had never been told. I asked her why the documents didn't match. Her response was a storm I should have seen coming. "How dare you accuse us of anything?" she snapped. "We raised you. We fed you. We clothed you. And this is how you repay us? By chasing money like some heartless stranger?" I tried to explain that I wasn't chasing anything, I just wanted the truth. But she was already spiraling, hurling accusations faster than I could process them. You always twist things, you always look for drama, you were always the problem, Elena. Always. Her voice was a knife sharp and familiar. Then my father got on the line. I could hear my mother breathing heavily in the background. His voice was tight, urgent. "This isn't the time," he whispered. "Please don't call again tonight." And then he hung up. I stared at my phone long after the call ended, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. Somewhere inside me, something cracked, not loudly but deeply, like a hairline fracture spreading through bone. That was when the memories began replaying themselves in painful clarity. Every Christmas dinner where she insulted me under the guise of joking. Every whispered correction, every fake smile in front of neighbors, every time she told relatives I was difficult or overly emotional. Every moment of childhood betrayal that I had convinced myself was normal. For the first time, all the pieces aligned: the humiliation, the gaslighting, the attic secrets, the trust hidden from me. My mother wasn't just strict, she wasn't just controlling. She was terrified of what I might uncover. The silence that followed the phone call was heavy, suffocating. It curled around me as I decorated my tiny studio with a strand of dollar store lights. I baked a batch of cheap sugar cookies and wrapped a knitted scarf I had been saving for my father, even though I doubted I'd see him again. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the apartment, soft and lonely. I checked my phone every few minutes. Christmas Eve came, then midnight, then morning. Nothing. Not a call, not a text, not a message, not even a mistake dial from the house I spent 18 years living in. I kept staring at the phone, waiting for it to light up, waiting for that one small sign that maybe, just maybe, they cared enough to say 2 words, "Merry Christmas." But the screen stayed black. On Christmas morning at 10:42, a notification finally appeared. For one hopeful second, my heart lifted. Then I saw the message. It was from my mother. 7 words. "Do not contact us again until you apologize." Apologize. For what? For asking about the trust that was legally mine, for wanting to understand the forged documents, for daring to exist outside her control. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand, realizing something with chilling clarity. She wasn't angry because I had done something wrong. She was angry because I had asked questions she never intended me to ask. Questions that threatened the story she had crafted for herself. Questions that threatened her control. That was the moment the abandonment became official. There was no fight, no goodbye, no explanation. Just silence. Cold, intentional silence. I cried into my pillow until the fabric was drenched. Grief mixed with anger, confusion mixed with clarity. I felt hollowed out and strangely steady all at once. Because beneath the heartbreak, a new feeling began to rise, something small and fragile but real. Survival. I wiped my face, stood up, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were swollen, but something in them looked different. Stronger. Sharper. I whispered to my reflection, "This will not be the end of me." And it wasn't. Over the next weeks, I took every extra shift I could. I studied harder. I saved every dollar. I began sketching business ideas in a cheap notebook. Words like trauma recovery, emotional healing, boundaries, empowerment. I didn't know it then, but those scribbles were the first seeds of the empire I would one day build. The silence of that Christmas didn't break me. It rebuilt me. Years later, standing on my parents' porch with my hand gripping the doorknob, I realized something else. They had abandoned me to punish me. But their silence had shaped me into a woman they could no longer control. And this time, I wasn't coming home for a seat at their table. I was coming home for the truth. The first winter I spent truly on my own felt like stepping into a world without gravity. There was no one to tell me where to stand, how to sit, what to fix about myself before I walked outside. The silence in my tiny studio apartment above the laundromat didn't ache the way silence used to. It felt clean. It felt like breathing after holding my lungs tight for 18 years. The studio didn't look like much peeling paint around the window frame. a radiator that hissed like it was fighting for its life, and a single overhead bulb that flickered whenever someone downstairs slammed a washing machine lid. My mattress lay directly on the floor, shoved into the corner beside a thrift store lamp, missing its shade. But every inch of that room belonged to me. Every breath, every decision, every mistake. For the first time, the air wasn't thick with someone else's expectations. I worked the breakfast shift at the diner 6 days a week. The regulars ordered the same thing every morning: black coffee, scrambled eggs, rye toast. Some left $2 tips. Some left none. On good days, a businesswoman in a tailored coat would leave me a crisp 20, and I'd slip it into a jar labeled "Someday." In the evenings, I shelved books at the community college library, breathing in the comforting smell of worn pages and old carpet. Psychology textbooks, business strategy guides, memoirs of people who climbed out of the shadows their childhood left behind. At the time, I didn't realize I was slowly climbing out of mine. One night at the diner, during a lull between the dinner rush and closing, a young woman slid into a booth with tears streaming down her face. She tried to hide it, but heartbreak has a sound, shaky breath, quiet, sniffling, a kind of trembling that radiates from the hands outward. I poured her a cup of tea and sat across from her during my break. She whispered that she'd fought with her mother, that she felt crazy and overly sensitive, that every conversation twisted into something she couldn't recognize. I knew that story. I had lived that story. "You're not crazy," I told her. "You're being gaslit." She blinked at me like no one had ever named her pain before. In that moment, I felt a pull in my chest, something like purpose, something like recognition. It was the first time I realized the years of family trauma I carried weren't just wounds. They were knowledge. And knowledge could help people. After that night, I became a quiet listener, a translator of emotions, a guide for strangers who didn't yet understand why their hearts felt like bruises. I didn't charge anyone. I didn't even think of it as work. It was just something I did because someone should have done it for me. On days when the diner was slow, I walked to the public library and camped out at a table in the back. I read every book I could find about boundaries, trauma, healing from toxic parents, emotional manipulation, and rebuilding self-worth. I filled notebooks with ideas for tools and worksheets, ways to help people understand what had happened to them and how to escape it with their dignity intact. Those notebooks would become the blueprint of a future business I had no idea I was building. In the evenings, I experimented with small projects. I wrote a digital journal filled with prompts for people healing from emotional wounds. I created affirmation cards and uploaded them to an online shop. I recorded a handful of simple guided meditations with a cheap microphone, whispering reminders I wish someone had told me growing up. "You are enough. You are allowed to rest. You are not your mother's voice." Most of these projects barely made any money. Sometimes $5, sometimes none. But every sale felt like a tiny spark lighting up the darkness. The first real flame came from a $1 digital workbook I titled "Healing After Toxic Parents." I uploaded it at midnight, unsure if anyone would ever read it. 3 days later, my inbox exploded with messages. Hundreds of downloads. A popular mental health blog featured it in an article called "Resources for Survivors of Family Trauma." People wrote things like, "Your words made me feel understood for the first time, and I thought I was alone until now." I cried in my studio that night, overwhelmed by the idea that something I created could help someone breathe easier. My audience grew quietly at first, then steadily. A licensed therapist reached out and said she'd been recommending my workbook to her clients. She asked if I'd co-create a mini-course with her about breaking generational cycles. The idea terrified me, but I said yes. The course sold almost 500 copies in its first month. Suddenly, my someday jar wasn't empty anymore. Leaving the diner felt like shedding an old skin. One night, after a customer shouted at me for bringing the wrong dressing, something inside me snapped, not loud, not violent, but certain. I untied my apron, folded it on the counter, and walked out the back door without saying goodbye. I didn't need the tips anymore. I didn't need the humiliation. I didn't need to shrink to keep the peace. I could finally choose myself. As my audience grew, so did the need for structure. I spent long nights creating a business plan, sketching out ideas for emotional tools, support groups, community resources. I settled on a name, North Star Guidance. The North Star had been the only thing I used to stare at through my bedroom window growing up, silently wishing for a different life. Naming my platform after it felt like honoring that younger version of me. One evening, as I was answering emails, a message popped up in my inbox from a tech founder named Daniel Brooks. He'd seen my workbook featured online and believed I could scale what I was doing into something much bigger. "You need an app," he said. "Something people can carry in their pockets." I reread his message 5 times, unsure if I should feel excited or terrified. Anytime someone offered to help me, I felt myself bracing, waiting for the catch, for the trap, for the manipulation I had been raised to expect. But Daniel wasn't pushy. He offered to build a simple prototype for free, just to show you what's possible. His kindness unsettled me in a way I wasn't used to. Kindness had never been safe in my childhood home. Still, something in me, some part of me that had learned to rise from silence, said yes. We created a basic emotional check-in app, nothing fancy, just a few daily prompts and boundary-setting scripts. I sent it to 100 of my followers for feedback. Within 24 hours, dozens responded, begging for more features, more guidance, more ways to understand the wounds they carried. That's when I realized the truth I had been building toward. Without knowing it, my pain wasn't just my own. It belonged to thousands of strangers with stories like mine, people whose hearts had been shaped by toxic parents, people searching for healing after emotional trauma. One night a month later, I received a call from a private number. I nearly let it go to voicemail until I heard my father's voice. "Elena, I heard about your business. Your grandmother would be proud." There was a pause. I heard him inhale, shaky and uncertain. "There were things she wanted you to have," he whispered. "Things your mother hid. Things I should have protected." Before I could ask him what he meant, I heard my mother shouting in the background. The phone rustled, then the line went dead. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, staring at my reflection in the window, older, stronger, but still carrying the outline of the girl my mother tried to erase. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would build something bigger than the silence they left me in. I would turn every wound into wisdom, every betrayal into purpose, every lonely Christmas into something worth remembering. And whether my mother liked it or not, I refused to disappear. Momentum didn't arrive with fireworks. It slipped into my life quietly, almost shyly, like it didn't want to startle me. One morning, I woke up to a flood of notifications, more downloads of my workbook, more messages from strangers thanking me for putting words to feelings they'd carried for years, more comments saying they finally understood their own childhoods after reading my writing. I sat there on my mattress, surrounded by the glow of my cheap laptop screen, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: direction. North Star Guidance wasn't supposed to grow. It started as survival, a way to process the wreckage of a family I no longer spoke to. But somehow other people found me. People with toxic parents, people who'd been gaslit, manipulated, pushed into silence. People carrying family drama they'd never been allowed to name. They saw themselves in my words. And that connection lit a spark I didn't know I was capable of. At first I thought the sudden attention was a fluke, a random wave that would fade in a week. But it didn't. Every morning brought more proof that something real was building. My $1 workbook on healing from toxic parents continued to spread through online support groups. Someone posted it on a forum for adult children of narcissists. Someone else shared it on a mental health subreddit. A blogger included it in a list called Top Resources for Survivors of Gaslighting. The day the blog post went live, my phone nearly overheated from notifications. Downloads tripled. Sales that used to crawl in 1 or 2 a day suddenly jumped into the hundreds. I remember staring at my Stripe balance in disbelief, the numbers shifting from tens to hundreds to thousands. It wasn't life-changing money yet, but for someone who had spent her whole adult life counting quarters for laundry, it felt like discovering oxygen. The shift didn't just happen online. People started emailing me personal stories, long, heartbreaking messages about mothers who manipulated them, fathers who stayed silent, siblings who turned their back. I read every word, sometimes crying quietly at my little table by the window. They weren't just telling me their pain, they were trusting me with it. And that responsibility pushed me forward like nothing else ever had. Then came the message from Dr. Naomi Whitfield, a licensed therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. She wrote to say she'd been recommending my workbook to clients dealing with mother-daughter conflict and emotional abuse. She wanted to collaborate on a digital mini-course. Her confidence in me was disorienting. For a moment, I felt like a child again, hearing my mother's voice in my mind. "You're not qualified. You're overreacting. Who do you think you are?" But the woman I was becoming refused to shrink. I wrote back and said yes. Working with Naomi was like finding a missing piece. She had clinical expertise. I had lived experience. Together, we created a course called Breaking Generational Cycles, filled with exercises on boundary setting, emotional regulation, and understanding the long-term wounds of family betrayal. We priced it low, $50, because we wanted to make it accessible. When the first launch email went out, I held my breath. Within 2 days, over 300 people enrolled. I sat on the floor of my studio after reading the final sales report, smiling so hard my cheeks ached. For the first time, I realized what I was building wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline, one I wish someone had handed me years ago. But success didn't feel entirely safe. Growing up with financial manipulation and hidden inheritance secrets had taught me that money could destroy families. I caught myself flinching each time my revenue increased, waiting for something terrible to happen. It felt like the universe would punish me for wanting more than survival. The fear wasn't logical, but trauma rarely is. Leaving the diner was the first step toward reclaiming control. The night I quit, a customer yelled at me for bringing the wrong dressing. I stood there holding a plate of cold salad, listening to him rant when something clicked into place. I wasn't the girl who accepted humiliation anymore. I didn't have to stay small to stay safe. I walked into the kitchen, untied my apron, folded it neatly on the counter, and left without telling anyone. The cold air outside hit my face like freedom. With the diner behind me, I poured everything into North Star guidance. I studied branding, marketing, user psychology, anything that could help me shape this flickering spark into something brighter. I built a small email list, wrote weekly newsletters about healing, created more worksheets, recorded gentle audio guides for people struggling with gaslighting and self-doubt. Slowly, the community grew. And then came the message that changed everything. The subject line read, "Your work has huge potential." It was from Daniel Brooks, a tech founder whose name I only vaguely recognized. He told me he'd been studying emotional wellness platforms and believed my content had the potential to scale far beyond digital downloads. "You need an app," he wrote, "something personalized. Something that makes emotional healing accessible in people's pockets." An app. The idea terrified me. Tech meant coding, investing, risk, things that felt too big for someone like me. But Daniel's message didn't sound like pressure. It sounded like someone holding open a door I didn't know existed. We met in a cafe downtown. He was kind, soft-spoken, and surprisingly attentive. Instead of telling me what to do, he listened to my story, my fears, my dreams. He told me he believed emotional recovery tools were becoming the next major wave in wellness. And he thought I could be at the forefront. Before I could spiral into self-doubt, he offered to build a prototype for free. "No pressure," he said. "Let's just see if people like it." Together, we created a simple beta app with daily emotional check-in scripts for handling manipulation and small exercises for people dealing with toxic parents. When we shared it with a test group of my followers, the feedback was overwhelming. People said it made them feel safe, understood, less alone. And watching the app take shape felt like watching a new version of myself take shape too. one who wasn't afraid of success anymore, one who understood that helping others didn't make me a target. It made me whole. Then one night in early spring, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice trembled through the speaker, quieter than I remembered. "I saw the app," he said. "Your grandmother, she would have been proud." Something cracked in me, grief, maybe, or longing. But then he whispered something that chilled me to my core. "There were things she meant to leave you. Things your mother hid. Things I should have told you years ago." Before I could speak, my mother's voice shouted from somewhere behind him. The phone rustled violently, and the call ended. I sat in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. Outside, snow drifted under the streetlights. Inside, an old ache pulsed in my chest. Answers were coming. Answers to questions I'd carried since childhood. Answers about the trust, the documents, the attic secrets. But one thing was already clear. My success, the one they ignored me, through the one they suddenly needed me for, was only just beginning. And my parents' silence was about to break. I didn't recognize the moment my life began to tilt toward something irreversible. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, while I sat at my thrift store desk sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug. Outside my studio window, the sun was barely awake, casting a thin strip of pale light over the laundromat roof. I was answering emails from people who had downloaded my workbook messages, filled with gratitude, confusion, fear, hope, when a subject line popped up that made my breath catch. Feature request, the young woman behind North Star Guidance. I stared at the words, convinced it was spam. No one from Forbes would ever contact me. Not the girl who once sat alone on Christmas morning waiting for a family that never showed up. Not the daughter who'd spent years shrinking herself to survive. But when I clicked the message, the signature at the bottom confirmed it: Maya Decker, senior writer, Forbes magazine. My hands shook so badly I had to set down my mug. The email said my digital products were gaining traction in online communities, that North Star Guidance had reshaped conversations about emotional healing, and that she wanted to feature my work in a long-form article. The words blurred as I reread them, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, as if summoned from the past, my mother's voice drifted through my mind. "Don't think you're special. You always exaggerate. No one wants to hear your story." That voice had lived inside me for years, a shadow I couldn't shake. But now another voice spoke louder, the one I'd been growing quietly, steadily, painfully. "You did this. You built this. You are allowed to be seen." I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my sweatshirt and typed back, "Yes, I'd be honored." The interview was scheduled for the following week. When the day arrived, I sat in my tiny studio with my laptop propped on 2 old textbooks and tried not to look nervous. Maya appeared on the screen with a warm smile, her hair pulled back, eyes bright with curiosity. She asked about my childhood, my experiences with gaslighting, the grief of estranged family relationships, and how my pain became the blueprint for North Star Guidance. I answered honestly, not naming my parents, not sharing private details, but speaking openly about family trauma, manipulation, and healing. When she asked what drove me, I said quietly, I wanted to give people what I needed most when I was young, a way to understand their hurt and a reason not to blame themselves. She sat silently for a moment, then said, "You didn't just build a business, you built a lifeline." Her words stayed with me long after the interview ended. 3 days later, the article went live. The headline took my breath away: "The young woman behind FIFYM ILIO no LLR Wellness Empire." Underneath, a full-color photo of me taken from my website looked back at me with a confidence I had fought to earn. The article spread like wildfire. Messages poured into my inbox. Followers doubled, then tripled. My courses sold out. Podcasters requested interviews. A TikTok therapist with millions of followers called my story a revolution in emotional recovery. My world cracked open in a way I never expected. And then the phone rang. It was a Maplewood number. For 5 years I had trained myself not to hope when that area code appeared. I had become frighteningly good at ignoring the ache that rose whenever I saw my hometown on the screen. But this time something cold and electric crawled up my spine. I let it go to voicemail. When the message icon appeared, I pressed play. Elena, it's your mother. 5 words, 5 years of silence collapsed under them. Her voice was saccharine sweet, dipped in honey and denial. We saw the article. Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud of you. We always knew you'd do something amazing. I froze. The air thickened. Proud. They ignored me for 5 Christmases, missed every birthday, blocked my number, hung up on me the night I asked about the trust. Now they were proud I could hear faint Christmas music in the background, decorations being hung, laughter. The same laughter that echoed through the walls of our house the night they left me alone in my studio apartment, waiting for a call that never came. Her voice brightened. We'd love to see you. The whole family wants to celebrate together. We're hosting a Christmas reunion in your honor. In my honor. 5 years of abandonment rewritten in a single sentence. She ended with, "Call us back. We miss you." I didn't return the call. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Another Maplewood number. My father this time. He didn't disguise the tremor in his voice. Your mother, she gets carried away. But I'm proud of you, truly. It'd mean a lot to see you. It's been too long. There was sadness in his tone, regret simmering beneath every word. For a moment my chest ached with the old longing for him to choose me, defend me, acknowledge the years I spent feeling invisible. But the ache passed. He had chosen silence for most of my life. He had watched my mother humiliate me and never stepped in. He had watched her erase me one holiday at a time. Still, he added softly, I hope you'll come home. I didn't respond. That evening, while typing a blog post for my website, another email arrived from my mother's address. The subject line read, Family Christmas Reunion, in honor of our daughter's achievements. The message was dripping with performance. We want to celebrate your success with the whole family. Everyone is excited to see our brilliant daughter. Your success reflects our family values. Family values. The words punched me harder than any insult ever had. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed through my empty apartment. Their values were silence, control, gaslighting, erasure. I had built everything despite them, not because of them. And now, with the world watching, they suddenly wanted me back. I spent the rest of the night pacing my small kitchen, torn between fury, grief, and a strange, quiet curiosity. Part of me wanted to reject the invitation and never look back. Another part, the wounded child buried deep inside, wanted answers. Why did they erase me? Why did they hide the trust? Why did my father whisper warnings he never explained? Why did my mother act like I was a threat instead of a daughter? By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going home for reconciliation. I wasn't going home to become their trophy. I wasn't going home to give them credit for a life they abandoned. I was going home for the truth, for the documents in the attic, for the secrets buried under years of silence, for the clarity I'd been denied my entire life. And maybe for the first time ever, I was going home for myself. As I packed my bag later that afternoon, a calm settled over me, not peace exactly, but resolve. The kind that comes when you finally stop running from your past and decide to face it head-on. When I stepped out into the cold winter air, locking my apartment behind me, I whispered to the empty street, this time I'm not walking into their home, I'm walking into their lies. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready. I hadn't stepped on that porch in 5 years, yet the house seemed to inhale the moment I approached, as if it recognized my footsteps before I even reached the door. A shadow moved behind the living room curtains, quick, nervous, unmistakably human. My hand froze on the doorknob. It wasn't my mother's silhouette. Hers was sharper, more rigid. This figure was smaller, almost hesitant, and the second our eyes met, even through the fabric of the curtain, it disappeared. A chill crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. The door opened before I could knock. My father stood there thinner than I remembered, shoulders sloped inward as though gravity had been unkind to him. His hair, once dark and neat, was now streaked with gray and uncombed. His eyes flickered across my face with a mixture of relief and dread. "Elena," he whispered, like saying my name out loud might summon trouble. "Hi, Dad," I said. He stepped aside to let me in, his hand trembling slightly as he held the door. The smell hit me first, cinnamon lemon polish, and the faint trace of pine. The same holiday scent they'd used for years back when I thought it meant joy instead of pressure. Walking into that house felt like stepping backward into a version of myself I had outgrown. The floorboards beneath my boots creaked the same way they always had. The entryway mirror reflected a memory me at 16, my mother behind me adjusting my posture before the neighbors arrived, whispering, "A lady doesn't slouch." I straightened instinctively. Then I forced myself to relax. My mother appeared from the kitchen, her smile brittle, her eyes calculating. She wore a perfectly chosen holiday dress, emerald green with pearls at the collar. She looked like she had walked straight out of a magazine spread about holiday elegance, except her expression carried the sharpness of a woman who had rehearsed every line she intended to say. "Oh, sweetheart," she exclaimed, arms outstretched. I didn't move toward her. Her arms dropped after a beat too long. "You look good," she added, her tone featherlight but strained. "Success suits you." "Hi, Mom," I replied evenly. Her gaze flicked quickly, almost involuntarily, to my bag, a quick check for what I might have brought into her house. When she didn't see anything alarming, she exhaled, relieved. The living room had been redecorated since I left. New stone fireplace, expensive furniture, carefully curated holiday decor that looked like it had been arranged by an interior designer. But as my eyes scanned the mantel, the bookshelves, the photo displays on the walls, I saw it immediately. There wasn't a single photo of me. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not even from the years before things fell apart. They had erased me. My stomach tightened. My mother must have noticed me looking because she launched into a rapid explanation about renovations, updated decor, wanting a clean, modern look. But I didn't miss the quick flicker of panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to look this closely. My father touched my elbow lightly. "Dinner's almost ready," he said quietly. His voice cracked on the last word. My mother shot him a warning glance, sharp as a blade. The same look I remembered from childhood, the one that meant keep quiet, don't ruin this. We sat around the kitchen island while my mother busied herself with ladles and serving dishes, narrating every action like she was hosting a cooking show. She made it sound like she had spent days preparing this dinner just for us, as if 5 years of Christmases without me had never existed. As if I were simply a daughter home from college, not the estranged child they had abandoned. She placed a dish in front of me. "Your favorite," she said brightly. "Stuffed rosemary chicken." "I haven't eaten that in years," I replied. She froze, smile twitching. My father cleared his throat softly. "Why don't you show Elena the living room decorations?" he said, trying to smooth the tension. But my mother didn't like suggestions, not from him, not from anyone. She glared at him before forcing a smile back onto her face. "Sure," she said. "Come see the tree." I followed her into the living room. The tree was tall, elegant, dripping with white lights and gold ornaments. A magazine-perfect display. It was the kind of tree she always wanted, impressive, flawless, soulless. On the table beside it sat a stack of holiday cards. I picked one up, a photo of my parents and Mason standing in front of the same tree. My mother beamed proudly. Mason grinned. My father looked tired. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't even mentioned in the greeting inside. My mother snatched the card from my hand so quickly it startled me. "Old photos," she muttered. "We misplaced the new ones." My father, who had followed us quietly, leaned closer to me and murmured, "Go upstairs when you can. Check the attic." My heart skipped. The attic. He nodded, eyes darting toward the kitchen where my mother was clanging dishes louder than necessary. "Before tonight, Before she gets rid of things, what things he swallowed hard, you'll understand. It was the same tone he used years ago when he whispered, "One day, the truth will find you." The same tone he used whenever my mother was within earshot. She called us back to the kitchen, then irritation already spreading across her face like a crack in glass. "What are you two whispering about? Nothing," my father said quickly. Her eyes narrowed. Dinner was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that trembles with everything unsaid. Forks clinked against plates. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. My father stared down at his food, avoiding both of our gazes. Mason's chair remained empty. Apparently he was arriving tomorrow for the big family celebration, the reunion my mother had staged to parade me around like a trophy. Halfway through the meal, I asked, "Where's the bathroom upstairs? I want to wash my hands." My mother's smile tightened at the edges. "I'll show," I remember I said, standing. My father coughed lightly, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something urgent. I climbed the stairs slowly, the old carpeting muffling my steps. Every inch of the hallway felt haunted by memories. Mason slamming doors, whispered arguments behind my parents' bedroom wall, the night I locked myself in my room to escape one of my mother's lectures. When I reached the attic door, I froze. The brass lock was the same. The chipped white paint, the faint scratch marks where I once tried to pick it with a hairpin when I was 12. I reached above the doorframe on instinct, and my hand closed around a small metal key. She'd hidden it in the same spot for 20 years. My breath trembled as I slid the key into the lock. The attic smelled like dust pine and forgotten winters. A single bulb hung overhead, flickering weakly. Boxes lined the walls, holiday decorations, old clothes, relics from a family narrative my mother had crafted, polished, and protected. And then I saw it. The cedar chest, tucked in the far corner, exactly where it was the night she caught me opening it. My hands shook as I knelt in front of it. I hesitated, listening for footsteps on the stairs. Nothing, just the hum of the heater downstairs. I lifted the lid. Inside lay the past she tried to bury. Hospital envelopes, legal forms, financial documents. A letter addressed to me from my grandmother dated 20 years ago, never opened. A birth certificate with handwriting that didn't match the one I had. And copies of 2 trust documents, one naming me as beneficiary, the other with my name crossed out. My chest tightened. Everything in that chest confirmed what I had feared, suspected, and felt deep in my bones. My mother hadn't just abandoned me. She had erased me, legally, financially, emotionally, piece by piece. A floorboard creaked behind me. My breath froze in my throat. I turned slowly, heart pounding. Someone was standing in the attic doorway. And whatever expression they wore told me everything in this house was about to change forever. Mason stood in the doorway like he'd wandered into the wrong movie, wide-eyed, startled, his breath visible in the cold attic air. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to see any of this. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The single bulb flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the floorboards. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, voice cracking. I closed the cedar chest, slowly keeping my hands planted on the lid. "Looking for old decorations," I said, trying to sound casual. His gaze darted to the chest. His throat bobbed. "You were never allowed in here." "Yeah," I said, my voice dry. "I remember." He stepped inside, his weight making the attic boards groan. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, older in a tired way, dark hollows under his eyes, a tense set to his jaw. Yet there was still something boyish in the way he shifted from foot to foot, nervously tugging at the cuff of his sweatshirt. "Mom doesn't want anyone messing around with this stuff," he whispered. "That's obvious," I replied. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally sighed. "Look, maybe you shouldn't be digging. She'll lose it if she knows." "I'm aware," I said, standing so the chest blocked his view of the documents inside. "But I'm not 12 anymore." His eyes flicked toward the stairs. "Just be careful. She's been on edge. More than usual. More than usual." That explained the sharpness in her voice, the tension in her smile downstairs. The entire house felt wired, like one wrong movement could shatter the fragile performance she'd built. "What do you know, Mason?" I asked quietly. He froze. His eyes widened for a split second before he schooled his expression. "What do you mean?" I stepped closer. "You knew I wasn't supposed to be up here. You knew she'd lose it, and you look terrified." "So what do you know?" His hands curled into fists. He looked away. "Dinner's almost ready," he muttered before turning toward the stairs. But that flinch, that quick twitch when I asked the question, told me everything. He knew something. Something big. Something he didn't dare say. When he disappeared down the staircase, I reopened the cedar chest with trembling fingers. The documents weren't just suspicious, they were damning. Hospital forms with crossed-out dates. 2 versions of my birth certificate, neither matching the one I had. Legal documents addressed to my father but signed in handwriting that looked eerily like my mother's. Letters from my grandmother that never reached me. And the trust documents, one naming me the primary beneficiary, the other with my name violently scribbled out. I took photos of everything, my breath unsteady as I documented each piece. It felt like each flash from my phone exposed a fracture in my childhood I had pretended wasn't there. For years, I told myself they were just dysfunctional, flawed, hurtful, but not malicious. Now I wasn't so sure. My phone buzzed in my hand, jolting me out of my thoughts. A text from my mother appeared on the screen. "Dinner. Now." Even through text, I could hear the control. I slipped the documents back into the chest, though the knowledge no longer fit inside. It pulsed through me: anger, dread, grief, clarity. I closed the attic door behind me, relocked it, and headed downstairs, the weight of the truth pressing against my ribs. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, silence hit me like a wall. My mother was stirring something on the stove with manic precision. My father sat at the table, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on his plate. Neither spoke at first. Then my mother turned, smile stretched too wide. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I said, sitting. Her eyes flicked over me, searching for cracks. "You were up there a while." "Lots of boxes," I replied. She forced a laugh. "Oh yes, your father hoards everything, old junk." She said it casually, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. My father lifted his head. Our eyes met briefly. He looked exhausted, guilty, like a man carrying truth in his pockets and terrified someone might ask him to empty them. Dinner was a quiet war. Mason barely touched his food. My father jumped slightly every time my mother moved, and my mother's cheerful chatter had the brittle tone of someone keeping an entire house of cards upright by sheer force of will. I didn't engage in any of it. I simply watched. Every rehearsed compliment she gave me, every tight smile, every perfectly timed laugh, every sidelong glance she exchanged with my father. It was all a performance. Halfway through the meal, she launched into a stream of sugary praise. "We're just so proud of you, sweetheart. You've done so well for yourself. Such success. And Forbes, my goodness, imagine that our daughter in Forbes." The emphasis on our daughter wasn't accidental. It was ownership disguised as affection. A claim she abandoned 5 years ago, suddenly reclaimed the moment it became useful to her. I swallowed a piece of chicken that tasted like dust. It didn't happen overnight. I worked hard. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I know. And we supported you the whole way." My fork clattered against my plate. Mason's head snapped up. My father closed his eyes. "Supported me," I repeated softly. My mother blinked. "Of course. We always believed in you. You erased me from photos. You hid my trust. You ignored me every Christmas. You told me I twisted everything. You watched me walk out and never looked for me. You pretended I didn't exist. My memories don't match yours," I said. Her smile twitched. "Well, you always were sensitive." There it was, the familiar dagger. The phrase she used to end every disagreement, every wound, every moment she wanted to dismiss. I took a slow breath. "You said that a lot when I was young. Sensitive, dramatic, misremembering." Her knuckles whitened around her wineglass. And yet I added, my memory has always been painfully accurate. Her eyes narrowed. What are you implying? My father tensed. Mason swallowed hard. I went to the attic, I said. The room pulsed with sudden silence. My mother's face